Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this second part of the webinar, how to facilitate effective and inclusive meetings. And in this second part of the webinar, we are going to talk about large meetings. So the first part, the first recording was about how to run meetings where you work with a smaller group of people, 10, maybe 15 maximum. And the goal of the meeting is to maybe develop a solution, brainstorm ideas. So it's goal oriented. This part of the webinar is going to focus on how to run effective, engaging, productive, and most importantly, inclusive large meetings, 20, 30 plus people. My name is Ekaterina Stoops, and I am the learning and development practitioner. I do workshops and presentations on different topics related to leadership development, organizational development, and professional development. Let's get started. Large meetings. Large meetings, again, I'm just sharing my perspective here. I don't know what the definition of like a formal definition of a large meeting is. In my mind, large meetings is when you have 20 plus participants. I've definitely attended a lot of virtual meetings where there are 50, 60 people attending and joining on Zoom or Teams. Different organizations use different virtual conferencing platforms, but it is usually 20 plus people. And like I said, I've attended many large meetings, and I noticed that what usually happens is that there are always people who would turn their cameras on, but there are actually a large group of people who would keep their cameras off. And I think when you run a large meeting, especially if you have 50, 60 people, it probably wouldn't even matter if everyone had their cameras on. It's still very hard to see everyone and really engage with everyone on this individual level. That's the kind of unique feature about large meetings. Another thing that I noticed when attending large meetings is that many large meetings are not very engaging and unfortunately not very inclusive. I want to give you one very specific example with Q&A. Usually when you have a large meeting, it's usually information sharing, updates, maybe some discussions like Q&A at the end. And I noticed that when for that Q&A part, when meeting organizers, facilitators ask a question, what usually happens is this awkward silence for a few very long seconds, and they're just seconds, but it may feel like a really long time because it's not in person, you don't really see people, so maybe it's just something about that virtual format that just feels that those few seconds may feel like a long pause. And then a few people would chime in with some comments and ideas. I call them few brave people would chime in. And also, I noticed another trend. And again, I've attended many virtual meetings to kind of, I'm seeing this happening again and again in different meetings run by different facilitators and even by different organizations. So there's always, like, if you have 50 people attending a virtual meeting and there's a Q&A, and there are maybe 5, 6, maybe 7 attendees who participate actively. They turn on their cameras, they turn on their mics or type in the chat, and you sometimes don't hear from the rest of the group. And if there are 60, 70 people who are attending your meeting and you're only hearing from 5, 6, 7, then my concern is that you may not be hearing from everyone in your virtual room. That goes into this question, how to make your meetings not only engaging but inclusive. Because usually the reason why you do Q&As for your meetings is to solicit feedback perspective comments from everyone in the room, right? Why else would you do a Q&A? So you would probably want to hear from as many people as possible. But if only a small percentage of attendees are actually sharing and engaging, you may not be hearing from everyone in your room, and that is not inclusive. So what are the solutions? Now that we identified a challenge, a common scenario, a common situation that happens during large meetings, how we can address this situation through solutions and strategies. Actually, I just remember that before we get into the strategies, I would like to also address why during large meetings, not everyone would be sharing and participating. It's actually very common, and it has something to do with this psychological safety. Based on decades of research, we know that people feel much more comfortable speaking out and sharing their ideas, perspectives, comments, feedback in small groups rather than in a large group setting. In education and teaching and learning, this phenomenon is well documented. Educators have been using small group discussions instead of large group discussions for decades. And the reason is because has something to do with the psychological safety phenomenon. We tend to open up and feel more engaged when we are in a small group setting, not when we are in a large group setting. This is something that is important to know if you organize and facilitate large meetings, and if you want everyone who attends your meetings to be engaged and to be participating. Now, the strategies. How would you address this? If now you know that asking important questions and soliciting feedback in a large group setting, it may not be inclusive because you may not be hearing from 80% of your participants. So what would you do? Well, the solution is very simple, and there are different strategies and techniques. But in this presentation, I want to focus on one, and it is small group discussions. Any virtual conferencing platform has breakout rooms, so it's really easy to set up. And what would you do when you have a Q&A part, or you're asking an important question and you want to hear from everyone in the room? You would just quickly set up breakout rooms, and then in small groups, they can discuss those questions. And also, what you could do is to give each group a shared document, like a Google Doc, where they can document their feedback, their comments, their questions, anything that they're discussing related to that specific question that you want them to focus on. And that could be anonymous. So that could be a really good way to solicit honest feedback from everyone if you actually make it anonymous. Then you would bring everyone into the main room, and then depending on the goal for your meeting, for your discussion, and also time, you could have, after that, you could have a large group discussion. You can actually ask maybe one representative from each group to share what their groups have discussed. You could do that, or you could just, if you don't have time or if you don't want to do a large group discussion, you could just use that shared document that each group was using, and that feedback that was collected from each group, you could use that. That is your research, that is your data, that is your input and feedback that you were soliciting from everyone. And both ways, large group discussion or a debrief, I call it, after small group sessions, or just using shared document is a powerful tool for collecting feedback from everyone in your virtual room. This is what you can do to make your meetings truly engaging and inclusive. And to wrap up this conversation, this discussion about virtual meetings, I also wanted to share some practical tips how to actually plan and organize your meetings to maximize productivity. So I want to share 3 steps. The first step in your planning process is setting clear objectives and outcomes for your meeting. And when I organize meetings, I like to ask myself these questions. They help me stay focused and plan productive and engaging meetings. The first question I like to ask myself is, what do I want to accomplish? What is the goal? What is the objective? What are my expectations from the participants? Do I want them to be actively involved? Do I want them to be collaborating and discussing with each other? And I also think about, if that's the goal, how will I communicate my expectations to everyone prior to the meeting, so they come to the meeting fully prepared in knowing what is expected of them. So that's the planning stage. Then the second step is mapping out your activities and engagement strategies. Now that you kind of identify what is it that you want to accomplish by asking people to join your meeting, then you can start planning activities. For example, if the goal of your meeting, if it's a small group of people and the goal of your meeting is to get things done, for example, if you're working on a document together as a group, then you may want to flip the meeting. And I talked about flipped meeting approach and how to plan flipped meetings in my previous presentation. It's a separate recording. It is in this playlist. Please watch the recording if you're interested. Or if you're running a large meeting and the goal is to solicit feedback from everyone who joins your meeting, then you may want to plan small group discussions and breakout rooms. And the third step is facilitation. So now you've planned, you have a goal, you communicated your expectations, you've planned all your activities, and of course, when everyone joins the meeting, you will need to be able to facilitate those discussions, to facilitate the group work, those activities that you planned. So that's the facilitation piece. And at the end of each meeting, I actually like to do a call to action activity that wraps up your meeting. And a call to action is really important because it just finalizes everything that you did during your meeting. And a call to action could be, well, it can vary depending on the goals of your meeting. It could be as simple as discussing dates for your next meeting, or maybe asking participants to take on some homework assignments in between the meetings. I know anything that would align with the goal of your meeting. And I do have a call to action for you. This is the end of this second part of the webinar that focused on how to facilitate engaging and inclusive large meetings. And my call to action is, so I would like to ask you to identify maybe one strategy that resonated with you the most and implement it in your next meeting. If you're planning to facilitate a large meeting, or if you are planning to facilitate a smaller meeting, you can also do group work and group discussions. So group work and group discussions is not just for large meetings. And also, if you're interested in flipped meeting approach and how to do it and when to flip your meetings, you can always watch the first part of the webinar where I talked about flipped meetings and how to do it. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you enjoyed this webinar. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me and we can have a more in-depth discussion about meetings.